In 1957, the Homestead Works of U.S. Steel employed somewhere between 15 and 18,000 workers, depending on the shift and the production cycle. Every one of them came through that gate carrying something. The object was so common, so universal to the experience of working in an American steel mill during that period, that almost no one thought to describe it carefully while there was still time. It was a metal pail, roughly the size of a large thermos, constructed in two tiers. The lower compartment held the food. The upper compartment held the coffee or soup, sealed against spilling during the walk from the streetcar or the parking lot. A handle arced over the top. The whole thing weighed maybe 3 pounds when full. It was called a dinner pail, sometimes a lunch bucket. The precise name varied by region and by ethnic community doing the naming. In Pittsburgh's mill neighborhoods, the older men often called it by the Polish or Slovak word their fathers had used, a word that meant something closer to provision than lunch. The word implied something you prepared against a need you already understood. That pail went through the Homestead Gate 15,000 times a shift. It went through the gates at Bethlehem's Sparrows Point, at Republic Steel in Cleveland, at Carnegie's Edgar Thomson Works in Braddock. It went through the main gate of U.S. Steel's Gary Works in Indiana, where by the mid-1950s, the workforce exceeded 20,000 on a peak production day. Men arriving from the Polish neighborhoods on the west side and the Croatian neighborhoods near the lake, and from the black neighborhoods on the east side that had been built by the Great Migration and rebuilt again by its second wave. The American steel industry had its peak in the early 1950s, employed over 600,000 workers in integrated mills. Every one of them ate something during a shift. What they ate, who made it, where it came from, and what it meant, that is almost entirely absent from the historical record. The steel industry generated congressional testimony and union contracts and production data and photographs of furnaces and rolling mills in extraordinary volume. The food culture that sustained the workforce that ran those furnaces was documented almost not at all. What follows is what the record does show: the logic of the shift. Before you can understand what went into the pail, you have to understand what the pail was up against. There is a persistent misconception about the American steel mill that locates it in the era of the 12-hour workday. That era was real, it was brutal, and it was documented in detail. The 1919 steel strike was fought partly over the 12-hour shift, and in 1923, a commission organized by Herbert Hoover and the American Iron and Steel Institute formally recommended its abolition. U.S. Steel ended the 12-hour day in August of that year. By the time the 1950s arrived and the post-war boom was running at full production, the standard contract shift at a union mill was 8 hours. The United Steelworkers of America had codified it, enforced it, and built an entire industrial life around it. But 8 hours in a steel mill is not 8 hours at a desk, and the shift system that replaced the 12-hour day created its own specific form of punishment, different in character, but not necessarily in effect. The integrated mill ran continuously. Blast furnaces do not have an off switch. Banking a furnace costs more than running it, and the metallurgical logic of steelmaking requires sustained heat measured in thousands of degrees, sustained over days and weeks without interruption. To keep that process running, the mill operated 3 rotating shifts: days, afternoons, called the turn by the men who worked them, and midnights, which the workforce called the hoot owl. A worker cycled through all 3 on a rotating weekly schedule: days 1 week, turn the next, hoot owl the week after, then back to days, except the transition from turn to days meant that a man coming off an afternoon shift on Sunday had roughly 8 hours before he was due back for the day shift on Sunday. The union contract permitted it. The body objected, but not formally. And then there was doubling up. When production demanded it, or when a man needed the money, and in these mill communities a man often needed the money, a worker could stay for a second consecutive 8-hour shift, 16 hours. The union governed this practice through specific contract provisions that varied by mill and by year. It was not rare. The men who did it regularly were known quantities in their departments, and their families knew what a doubled shift meant. Dinner held, children kept quiet, and a second pail either packed in advance or organized on the fly. The pail had to work across all of this. It had to function as breakfast if you were on the hoot owl, as lunch if you were on days, as dinner if you were on turn, eating at 10 o'clock at night against a furnace that was throwing heat at 2,800 degrees. And in the event of a double, it had to be enough food for a working body that was burning through calories at a rate that modern occupational health studies of comparable heavy labor estimate at somewhere between 3,000 and 4,500 per shift, though no one measured it precisely at the time. That figure was not a calculation the men or their wives made. It was a physical fact their bodies already knew. You packed more than you thought you needed, and you were usually right.
Who packed it? The pail did not pack itself. Behind every dinner pail that came through the mill gate in 1957 was a woman who had been up before the shift started, which, depending on the week, might mean 4:30 in the morning or 11 o'clock at night. The majority of those women were wives. They lived in the mill neighborhoods, within walking distance or a short streetcar ride of the gates. They organized their domestic labor around a schedule that rotated every week, which meant they were managing the rhythm of a household, sleeping children, evening meals, morning meals, against a clock that never settled into the same pattern twice. When her husband was on hoot owl, she packed at midnight. When he was on days, she packed before dawn. When he doubled, she packed twice, or she got a phone call that meant the first pail would have to stretch. This labor is almost entirely invisible in the historical record. Margaret Byington documented its predecessor in 1910 in her foundational study of homestead household economics, Homestead, the Households of a Mill Town, published by the Russell Sage Foundation. Her account of how mill families organized food, time, and money around the shift schedule remains the most detailed primary source available for that period. By the 1950s, those same families had been in America for 30 or 40 years. The children of the men Byington studied were now the workers, and their wives were doing a version of the same domestic calculation their mothers and grandmothers had done, calibrated now to the 8-hour shift and the union wage, but structurally similar in its orientation around a mill schedule that organized everything else. The boarding house was a second source, and by the 1950s it was in decline. In the first wave of Eastern European immigration, from the 1880s through the First World War, the boarding house had been a central institution. A widow or a married woman with a large household would take in 6 to 12 single men from the same national origin community, feed them, do their laundry, and pack their lunches in exchange for a weekly payment that often constituted the household's primary income. Byington documented households in Homestead taking in as many as 14 boarders. The system worked because it required no English, no formal contract, and no infrastructure beyond a large kitchen and a woman willing to run it at scale. By the mid-1950s, the men who had arrived as boarders had become the men with families in the owned houses on the mill streets. Their sons were in the mill now. The boarding house was not gone. It persisted, particularly among newer arrivals and among single workers whose family situations did not include someone to pack for them. But it was no longer the dominant institution it had been. It was fading, and most of the women still running them were old, and when they died, the institution died with them. The third source was the commercial one, the corner deli, the ethnic grocery, the neighborhood butcher who sold already made sandwiches wrapped in paper from behind the same counter where he sold the meat by the pound.
These businesses knew the shift schedule as well as the mill's own timekeeper. A deli on 8th Avenue in Homestead that catered to the day shift opened in the dark and had everything ready before the gate opened at 6 a.m. The same deli might stay open past midnight for the men coming off the hoot owl who wanted something to eat or to pack for the next rotation. The commercial food option was not the primary one. The majority of what went through that gate was made at home, but it was real. It was oriented entirely to the mill, and it was part of the same ecosystem. 3 different women, one in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and kielbasa at 5 in the morning, one managing a boarding house that ran like a small restaurant for men who never sat at the same table twice, one behind a counter in an apron who knew every regular's order and started making it when she saw him come through the door. None of them are in the labor history. All of them fed the workforce.
What went in the old country in the pail? The food that Eastern European mill workers carried was specific in the way that foods produced by specific communities under specific needs of need always are. It was not cuisine in any formal sense. It was not designed or invented. It was the residue of a food tradition that had developed over centuries in the villages of Poland, Slovakia, Ukraine, Croatia, and Serbia under conditions of agricultural poverty and long physical labor, and it crossed the Atlantic largely intact because it worked. Start with the bread. The bread matters more than anything else in the pail because the bread was the medium for everything. In the Polish and Slovak neighborhoods of Homestead and Braddock and McKee's ports, the bread came from specific bakeries that the whole community knew by name. Dense rye, sometimes pumpernickel, a loaf heavy enough that a single slice was a substantial object, with a crust that could survive a morning in a metal pail without going soft. The bakery was not a preference, it was an identity. Men knew whose bread was whose from the smell when a pail opened. Oral histories collected by the Rivers of Steel National Heritage Area describe workers identifying each other's lunches by the bakery, not "that smells like rye," but "that's Kowalski's." The bakery encoded the neighborhood encoded the community encoded where the family had come from 40 or 50 years and 4,000 miles before. On that bread, kielbasa most commonly, not the mild, pre-sliced supermarket version that would come later. This was the kielbasa from the butcher shop that had been in the same building since the original wave of immigration. Dense, heavily smoked, garlicked to a degree that a non-Polish palate found aggressive and a Polish palate found exactly right. It held up to hours in a metal container without deteriorating. It was high-fat, high-protein, high-calorie, and cheap. It was engineered by a century of use for precisely the application it was being used for. Alongside it, hard-boiled eggs packed 2 or 3 at a time, kapusta, sauerkraut-based preparations that varied by household and by season, often incorporating pork fat or smoked meat, cold pierogies. This last item deserves a clarification because the pierogi in the lunch pail was not quite the same object as the pierogi served at a family table on Sunday. The lunch pail version was denser, made with a thicker dough that could withstand being cold and compressed for several hours without becoming unpleasant. Women who made them specifically for the pail adjusted the recipe accordingly, not as a conscious decision, but as the accumulated practice of making them for that purpose over many years. And then the raw onion. This detail appears in oral history accounts with a consistency that makes it impossible to treat as incidental. A full onion or half of one tucked alongside the sandwich, eaten whole, bitten into like an apple alongside everything else. This was not considered remarkable by the men who did it or by the community around them. It was a remnant of Central European peasant food practice, the onion as a standard accompaniment to any substantial meal, that crossed the Atlantic without modification and persisted in the mill lunch pail long after it had disappeared from the dinner table. It was the kind of food detail that survives in practice after it stops being legible as tradition.
The coffee in the upper tier came from home, made strong and sweetened with sugar, sometimes with condensed milk carried separately in a small jar. By the time it had been sitting on a steam pipe for 2 hours, it was not exactly what had been poured that morning. The men drank it anyway. The warmth was the point. In the hoot owl's 3 a.m. lull in a locker room that smelled of grease and metal and cigarette smoke, a cup of coffee that had been kept warm by a steam pipe for 2 hours was exactly what it needed to be.
What went in? The South in the Pail. The Great Migration did not move people north in a single wave. It moved in two. The first accelerating during World War I, when the wartime labor shortage cracked open industrial employment for black workers who had been systematically excluded from it, and the second surging in the 1940s and 1950s as agricultural mechanization in the South eliminated the sharecropping economy that had kept millions of black families in the same counties their grandparents had worked as slaves. Gary, Indiana, received a significant portion of both waves. Pittsburgh received another. By the mid-1950s, the black workforce in Gary's mills was substantial, employed in specific departments, constrained by the same documented patterns of occupational segregation that characterized industrial employment across the North, but present in numbers large enough that their food culture was a daily reality in the same locker rooms and on the same 30-minute breaks as everything else. They brought a food tradition that was as specific and as deeply rooted as anything in the Eastern European pails, and it solved the same problem: high caloric density, durability, portability, made from cheap ingredients by a woman working around a rotating shift schedule with completely different materials. Cornbread instead of rye, not the thin, crumbly northern version that would be made with more flour and less corn. The dense, savory southern version made in a cast iron skillet, sliced into pieces that held their shape in a metal pail for hours. Fried chicken packed cold, a preparation that had been optimized over generations for exactly this kind of portable eating, the skin crisped and sealed in fat against the meat, durable at room temperature in the way that made it practical for an 8-hour shift in the way that few foods are. Green beans or collard greens cooked long and slow with smoked pork, fatback, hog jowl, whatever was available, until they were intensely savory and could be eaten cold out of a small container without losing their character. Sweet potato pie wrapped in cloth or paper, as calorie-dense and sweet as the pierogi on the other side of the locker room. The women packing these lunches were doing the same calculation as the women on the other side of the neighborhood. Rotating shift schedule, variable start times, a body that was going to burn through everything in the pail and want more. They were using different ingredients drawn from a different tradition, but they were solving an identical problem with the same underlying logic: high fat, high starch, high protein, cheap per calorie, made with skill that looked like habit. The lunch break in the mill was formally desegregated before lunch was formally desegregated anywhere else in Gary or Pittsburgh. But desegregation in the contract did not immediately produce integration at the table. John Hinshaw's research on race and class in Pittsburgh mills documents the social clustering of the lunch break, men eating in groups organized by race and ethnicity, both by custom and by the social consequences of violating it. The Calumet Regional Archive's oral histories record the same pattern for Gary through the 1950s. The locker room held both food cultures simultaneously, in close physical proximity, separated by a social distance that had nothing to do with the distance between the pails. What happened over time in the 1960s and into the 1970s as those barriers became more permeable is less formally documented. Oral histories suggest a gradual, uneven, unsentimental contact, a piece of cornbread accepted, a length of kielbasa offered in return, not as a symbolic act, but as the ordinary transaction of men who worked next to each other for 20 years. The food crossed the social boundary before the social boundary fully dissolved. That is not a reconciliation story. It is a food story, which is a different and more reliable kind of history. The 30 minutes.
The United Steelworkers contract guaranteed a 30-minute meal period. 30 minutes. In the context of a shift that began with a furnace charge and ended with a product that had been liquid metal an hour before, 30 minutes was the only pause. Where a man ate depended on where he worked. A furnace worker might eat at the worksite, close enough to the heat that the food stayed warm without the pipe's help. A rolling mill worker ate in the locker room. Mills that had cafeterias, and by the 1950s, many of the larger operations had expanded their cafeteria facilities, though the quality and the hours varied significantly by mill, offered a commercial alternative for those who preferred it or whose situation required it. The man who had no one to pack for him, the man on an unplanned double, the man whose wife was sick, he went to the cafeteria, and what he found there was serviceable and forgotten the moment he left. What happened in the locker room during those 30 minutes was not forgotten. The pail opened. The coffee tier came down from the pipe, held in a hand that was still radiating heat from the furnace floor. Around a man, other men were doing the same thing, the same gesture, the same brief steam from an uncapped container, the same unwrapping of paper or cloth. The smells arrived simultaneously: kielbasa, rye, coffee gone slightly stale from 2 hours on the pipe, cornbread, fried chicken, cigarette smoke, because most of them smoked, and the cigarette often came before the food or ran alongside it. The ambient smell of the mill, metal and grease in a sulfurous undertone that a man stopped noticing after the first week and never stopped carrying home in his clothes. The conversation in those 30 minutes was not about work, or was not primarily about work, because work was everywhere else. These 30 minutes were about other things: the game, the kids, the car, the union meeting, a grievance filed and not yet resolved, a foreman who needed to be talked about in terms that would not be used in earshot of the foreman. The kind of conversation that is only possible among men who are briefly horizontal together after hours of vertical effort, specific, unhurried, not quite relaxed, but relieved. The ethnic clustering documented by Hinshaw and the Calumet archives was real, and it mattered. It was not random. Men clustered with men from the same neighborhood, the same church, the same national origin community, because those were the men they had come in with, the men whose kids went to school with their kids, the men whose wives knew their wives. The lunch break reinforced community bonds that the mill floor, with its noise and danger and hierarchies of seniority, had little time for. For 30 minutes, the social geography of the neighborhood reassembled itself inside the mill. The coffee, when it was good, when the woman who packed it had gotten the strength right and the pipe had kept it at exactly the right temperature, was the thing that men mentioned first when they were asked 40 years later what they remembered about lunch. Not the kielbasa, not the pierogies, the coffee, because the coffee was warmth in a specific sense that the food was not. You ate because your body required it. You drank the coffee because someone had made it for you, and they had made it right. And for the 30 minutes it lasted, you were not in the mill.
The neighborhood that built the pail. The dinner pail did not originate in the kitchen alone. It was the end point of a supply chain that ran through the neighborhood, and the neighborhood had been built, its commercial geography, its street-level economy, its hours of operation, almost entirely around the mill. Walk the blocks surrounding the Homestead Works in 1957, before the first shift change, and the neighborhood is already in motion. The Polish bakery on 8th Avenue has been running since before midnight. Rye and pumpernickel loaves that will be sold starting at 4 a.m. to women who need them for the morning pail, and to men on their way home from the hoot owl who are buying tomorrow's bread because the store will be closed when they wake up. The Slovak butcher 2 doors down opens at 5 a.m. for the same reason. His kielbasa is in the case, made to a recipe that his father brought from a village in the Tatra foothills, and that he has adjusted precisely once in 30 years of making it. More smoke because American smokehouse temperatures run different. The adjustment took 3 years to get right. No one outside the neighborhood would know the difference,
but everyone inside it would. The deli on the corner knows which men are on which shift because it has been serving the same families for 2 generations and because the mill's shift schedule is the neighborhood's clock. The day shift men come in between 5 and 4:45. The turn shift men's wives come in during the afternoon, buying for the evening pail. The hoot owl men's wives come in the morning, later when the children are at school and the house is quiet. The deli adjusts its stock and its hours accordingly. It has always done this. It will do this until it cannot. The boarding house keepers, fewer of them now, older, operating on a smaller scale than they had in the 1920s, are doing the same thing on a more intimate register. A woman on Maple Street in Homestead is packing 4 pails for 4 single men who have been renting her rooms for a combined total of 30 years. She knows what each of them will and will not eat. She knows that the one from Krakow wants extra onion, and the one from the Donbass region of Ukraine has never trusted sauerkraut, and the one who came up from Birmingham in 1951 wants cornbread with his coffee, and the youngest one, 23, from a farm outside Lviv, will eat anything she puts in front of him and thank her in Ukrainian every time. She packs 4 different pails from one kitchen. She does this without thinking about it, the way you do not think about the knowledge you have been using every day for 30 years. The commercial geography of the mill neighborhood was not designed. It accreted over 50 years in response to a single organizing logic, a large workforce arriving and departing on a rotating schedule that never stopped, always hungry, always needing something for the shift ahead. Every business on those blocks existed in relationship to that logic. The grocery that stocked the specific brand of lard that the Polish community used, the drugstore that opened at 6 a.m., the tavern that opened for the hoot owl men coming off at 6 a.m., because those men needed a drink before bed, the same way the day shift men needed one at 3 p.m., and whose hours the city council had eventually stopped trying to regulate back to conventional times. The food culture of the mill neighborhood was not separable from the commercial culture of the mill neighborhood. They were the same thing. The Pail was where they met.
What ended it? The decline did not begin with the closures. It began earlier and more quietly. Through the 1960s, the mill cafeteria was expanding, not at every mill and not uniformly, but the trend was documented. Larger facilities, longer hours, subsidized meals negotiated into some union contracts. The gradual normalization of buying lunch at the mill rather than carrying it from home. Vending machines arrived in the locker rooms in the late 1950s and spread through the 1960s, a development regarded by the older men with the specific contempt reserved for things that are convenient and wrong. The percentage of workers carrying a dinner pail from home was declining before the first major closure. The system was already under pressure from the inside. But the cafeteria and the vending machine were evolutionary pressures. What came next was extinction. The deindustrialization of the American steel industry in the late 1970s and 1980s was not a gradual decline. It was a series of sudden, total stops. Bethlehem Steel closed its Lackawanna plant near Buffalo in 1983. The Homestead Works, 15,000 workers running continuously since 1881, the site of the 1892 strike that defined American labor history, closed in 1986. U.S. Steel's South Works in Chicago closed in 1992. Gary's East Side neighborhoods, which had housed the African-American mill workers and their families, and the churches and the food businesses that served them, were hollowing out through the same process. The commercial street that had been built on the spending power of mill wages lost that spending power when the mill wages disappeared. The cornbread bakeries and the soul food restaurants and the groceries that stocked the specific dried beans and smoked meats that Southern origin cooking required, some of them held on longer. Some of them had a customer base that was not exclusively mill-dependent. But the gravitational center of the neighborhood's economy had been the mill, and without it, the neighborhood's commercial life began to restructure around an absence,
in the same way Pittsburgh's had. The women who had packed the pails were by the late 1980s in their 50s and 60s, if they were still in those neighborhoods at all. The boarding house keepers were old. The last of them, the women who had been running those operations since the 1940s, who had packed hundreds of thousands of individual lunches over 30 years of continuous operation, were dying, and they were dying without being asked what they knew.
What the record shows. The Rivers of Steel National Heritage Area in Pittsburgh began collecting oral histories from mill workers and their families in the 1990s. The Calumet Regional Archives at Indiana University Northwest has been doing the same for the Gary area since the 1970s. What both archives found when they sent interviewers into those communities was that the clock had nearly run out. The men who had carried the pails were largely gone. The women who had packed them were elderly, and many were already gone, and the ones who remained had not been asked about this specific thing, not the union contract, not the strike history, not the production data, but the specific thing. What did you put in the pail, and how did you make it, and where did you get the bread? What was recovered is fragmentary but specific. A woman in Homestead, interviewed in the mid-1990s, describing the kielbasa from a specific butcher whose name she remembered and whose building was by then something else. An elderly black man in Gary, one of the last generation to have worked the open hearth, describing his wife's cornbread in the precise technical terms of someone who had eaten it every working day for 25 years. A Slovak woman in McKeesport who still had her mother's recipe for the denser pierogi made specifically for the pail, written in a language she no longer spoke fluently but could still read for this purpose. These fragments exist. They are in archives that are accessible to researchers and increasingly to the public. They are not nothing. But they are the exception. The lunch culture of the American steel mill, the dinner pail, the steam pipe, the 30 minutes, the two parallel food traditions eating in the same locker room in every mill in Pittsburgh and Gary for 30 years generated almost no formal documentation while it was happening. It produced no cookbooks. It produced no restaurants that preserved and transmitted its specific tradition. It produced no food media moment that would have required it to be recorded accurately in order to be performed. The pierogis survived, and the kielbasa survived, and the cornbread survived, and the fried chicken survived, but stripped of the context that gave them their specific meaning, which was not heritage food or ethnic identity, but fuel, engineering, the daily solution to the problem of keeping a body functional through 16 hours of work near an open hearth furnace in August. The Homestead Works site is now a shopping mall and a waterfront development. The building that housed the steam-powered blowing engines, the ones whose pipes kept the coffee warm, is a parking structure. The gate the pails went through every morning is gone. The last woman in Homestead who packed a pail for a husband going to work at the mill would have done so sometime in 1986. She made the sandwich, she poured the coffee into the upper tier, she set it on the kitchen table next to his jacket. She did this the way she had done it for 20 or 25 years, which is to say, without thinking about it, the way you do not think about the knowledge you have been using every day until the day there is no longer any reason to use it. What she knew is gone. What she made is gone. What it meant, the specific weight of it, the precision of it, the way it encoded a community and a culture and a way of organizing daily life around the physical fact of industrial labor, almost none of that was written down before the people who carried it died. The pails are in antique stores now. You can buy one for $40. Nobody sells what went in them.